"No change. Get off," the driver yelled. The old man held out his $50 bill. He only owed $8. "But, sir," he didn't get a chance to finish before the bus door slammed shut. He was left standing in the rain. But that young girl on the bus, she pulled out her phone and started typing something. What happened 20 minutes later changed that driver's life forever. Welcome to True Veteran Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning rain tapped steadily against the windows of Route 47 as it wound through the older neighborhoods of Cedar Valley. It was the kind of drizzle that made everything look gray, made the world feel smaller, colder. Most passengers kept their heads down, lost in their phones, or staring blankly out the fogged windows. Robert Chen had been driving this route for 3 years. Same stops, same faces, same routine. At 34, he'd grown tired of the job, tired of dealing with difficult passengers, tired of the complaints about exact change policies. His supervisor had been clear: no exceptions, exact change only, company policy. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The 9:15 departure from downtown was running 5 minutes late due to traffic. Robert drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, checking his watch. He had a schedule to keep. At Morrison Street, an elderly man climbed aboard slowly, gripping the handrail carefully. He wore a faded brown coat, too thin for the weather, and carried 2 heavy grocery bags from the discount market. His gray hair was damp from the rain, and his weathered hands shook slightly as he reached into his pocket. "Good morning," the man said quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine. "One fare, please." Robert glanced up from his logbook. The fare was $2.75. The old man held out a crumpled $20 bill. "Exact change only," Robert said without looking up. "Can't break big bills." The elderly man, whose name was Frank Morrison, though Robert didn't know that yet, blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, this is all I have. I just came from the grocery store and—" "Company policy," Robert interrupted, finally looking at him. "Exact change or you can't ride. There's an ATM at the gas station 2 blocks back." Frank looked out at the rain, then back at Robert. "Sir, I'm 78 years old. I just walked 6 blocks from the market with these bags. Could you please make an exception? I can pay you the extra next time. No exceptions." Robert's voice was firm, final. "Either you have exact change or you don't ride." The bus had gone quiet. 23 passengers sat in uncomfortable silence, watching the exchange. Most avoided eye contact, buried deeper in their phones, pretended not to see. But in the third row, a young woman named Sarah Williams watched with growing unease. She was 24, a social worker who took this bus every morning to reach the community center where she worked with elderly clients. She'd seen this kind of situation before, bureaucratic inflexibility meeting human need, and it never sat right with her. Frank stood there for a moment, the weight of his grocery bags pulling at his thin shoulders. His eyes moved from Robert to the passengers, a quiet plea that went unspoken. No one moved. No one offered to help. "I understand," Frank said finally, his voice even quieter now. "I'll walk." He turned slowly, carefully navigating the narrow aisle back toward the door. As he passed Sarah's seat, she noticed something that made her heart skip. Pinned to the inside of his coat was a small, faded ribbon, purple with a bronze star in the center. She recognized it immediately from her work with veterans, a Purple Heart. The door wheezed open, and Frank stepped back into the rain. Through the window, Sarah watched him readjust his grip on the grocery bags, pull his thin coat tighter, and begin walking. His limp was barely noticeable, but it was there, a slight favor of his left leg that spoke of an old injury. The bus pulled away, leaving him standing at the stop, growing smaller in the side mirror. Robert felt a twinge of something, guilt maybe, but pushed it aside. Rules were rules. He had a job to do. But Sarah couldn't let it go. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, her thumbs moving across the screen with purpose. She didn't know Frank's name yet, didn't know his story, but she knew enough. Her first message went to the local Facebook community group, Cedar Valley Neighbors. Just witnessed an elderly veteran forced off bus route 47 because he didn't have exact change for a $2.75 fare. Driver wouldn't accept a $20 bill. This man is walking in the rain with heavy groceries. This is not okay. Bus number 4721, Morrison Street stop, heading toward Pine Avenue. If anyone sees him, please help. Within 3 minutes, her phone started buzzing. Comments poured in. What's his name? Which direction is he walking? I'm driving that area now, looking for him. This is terrible. That driver should be reported. Sarah quickly added more details. Elderly man, brown coat, 2 grocery bags, appears to be a veteran based on metal I saw, limping slightly. Last seen walking east on Morrison from the bus stop. The post was shared, then shared again and again. Meanwhile, Frank Morrison continued his slow walk home, the grocery bags cut into his fingers, and his old war injury, a piece of shrapnel that had never been fully removed from his thigh, sent shooting pains down his leg with each step. But he'd walked longer distances in worse conditions. Vietnam had taught him endurance, if nothing else. He was a block and a half from the bus stop when a car pulled over beside him. A middle-aged woman rolled down her window. "Excuse me, sir," she called out. "Are you the gentleman who was just on the bus?" Frank stopped, confused. "I'm sorry?" "I saw a post online, something about bus fare. Can I give you a ride?" Before Frank could answer, another car pulled up behind the first. Then another. Within 10 minutes, Morrison Street had become an impromptu convoy of Good Samaritans, all looking for the same elderly man. Sarah's post had exploded across social media. It had been shared in veteran support groups, neighborhood watch pages, and local news feeds. The story grew with each share. Veteran abandoned by bus driver. War hero left in rain over 275. Community rallies for forgotten soldier. But the real turning point came when Frank's neighbor, Maria Santos, saw the post. She recognized the description immediately and added a comment that changed everything. "That's Frank Morrison. He lives 3 blocks from me. He's a Purple Heart recipient who served 3 tours in Vietnam. He volunteers at the VA hospital every week and has been helping veterans for 40 years. He lost his wife last year and barely gets by on his pension. This is absolutely heartbreaking." The post exploded. Within an hour, it had been shared over 2,000 times. Local news outlets picked it up. The bus company's phone lines lit up with complaints. Frank, meanwhile, had gratefully accepted a ride from the first woman who stopped, Linda Carter, a nurse from the local hospital. She drove him home, helped carry his groceries, and insisted on giving him her phone number in case he ever needed help again. "You shouldn't have had to walk," she told him as they stood on his small front porch. "What that driver did was wrong." Frank shook his head. "People have rules to follow. I understand that." But Linda didn't understand. None of the growing crowd of people following this story understood. How could a society that claimed to honor its veterans allow this to happen? Back on Route 47, Robert was finishing his shift, unaware that his name was now trending on local social media. His supervisor, Janet Phillips, was about to have the worst afternoon of her career. The first call came at 2:47 p.m. "Cedar Valley Transit, this is Janet. I want to file a complaint about one of your drivers," the voice said. "Bus number 4721. By 3:30, Janet had fielded 47 similar calls. By 4, the local news station had contacted her for a statement. By 5, the story was the lead item on the evening broadcast. The reporter stood outside Frank's modest home, microphone in hand. Tonight, a 78-year-old Purple Heart recipient was forced to walk home in the rain because a bus driver refused to make change for a $20 bill. The incident has sparked outrage across our community and raised questions about how we treat our veterans. Frank had reluctantly agreed to a brief interview, but only after being assured that he wasn't trying to get anyone in trouble. "I don't want the young man to lose his job," he told the reporter, sitting in his small living room surrounded by photos of his late wife Helen and his military service. He was following rules. "I understand that." But the community didn't share Frank's forgiveness. The next morning, Robert Chen arrived at the depot to find himself suspended pending investigation. His supervisor pulled him into her office with a grim expression. "Robert, we need to talk about yesterday's incident." "What incident?" Janet turned her computer screen toward him. The local news website showed Frank's face next to the headline, "Bus driver abandons war veteran over exact change policy." Robert's stomach dropped. "I was following company policy. You said, I said exact change only, but I also said to use common sense and show compassion." This man is a decorated veteran, Robert. He served our country for 3 tours in Vietnam. I didn't know that. You didn't ask. You didn't look. You just followed the rule without seeing the human being in front of you. The suspension was just the beginning. The story had taken on a life of its own. Frank Morrison began trending on social media. Veterans organizations condemned the transit company. City council members called for policy changes. But something else was happening too, something beautiful. Sarah Williams, the young woman whose post had started it all, organized a community fund for Frank. Within 48 hours, it had raised over $15,000. Local businesses offered Frank free services. The VA hospital where he volunteered honored him at a special ceremony. Most importantly, the transit company instituted new policies. Drivers could now accept up to $20 bills for fares, and all employees underwent sensitivity training focused on serving vulnerable populations, especially veterans and elderly passengers. Robert Chen was eventually reinstated after completing additional training and writing a personal apology to Frank. The two men met at Frank's home on a quiet Sunday afternoon. "I'm sorry," Robert said, standing awkwardly in Frank's living room. "I should have seen past the rule to the person." Frank, gracious as always, offered him coffee. "We all follow rules, son. Sometimes we forget why the rules exist in the first place." "Why don't you hate me?" Robert asked. Frank was quiet for a moment, then pointed to a framed photo on his mantel. Him and Helen on their wedding day, him in his army dress uniform. "I spent 3 years in Vietnam," he said softly. "I saw what hate does to people. Life's too short for that. Besides, something good came from this. People remembered that we're all in this together." 6 months later, Frank Morrison was invited to speak at the transit company's annual Employee Appreciation Dinner. He stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of drivers, mechanics, and administrative staff. "I didn't come here tonight to talk about rules or policies," he began, his voice stronger than it had been that rainy morning. "I came to talk about kindness, about seeing each other not as problems to solve, but as neighbors to help." He paused, looking directly at Robert, who sat in the third row. "A wise person once told me that rules exist to help us treat each other better, not to give us excuses to treat each other worse. Every day, you drivers carry people through their lives, to work, to the hospital, to see loved ones, to come home. You're not just following routes, you're connecting communities." The applause was long and heartfelt. But Frank wasn't finished. "I want to thank a young woman named Sarah Williams, who saw something wrong and decided to act. I want to thank the dozens of strangers who stopped to help an old man they'd never met. And I want to thank Robert Chen, who taught me that redemption is always possible when we're willing to learn." In the audience, Sarah wiped away tears. She'd been promoted to supervisor at the community center, partly because of the leadership she'd shown during the Frank Morrison incident. Robert stayed after the dinner, approaching Frank as the crowd dispersed. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said that day, about following rules. I want you to know, I see people now, really see them." Frank smiled and patted the young man's shoulder. "That's all any of us can do, son. See each other, help each other. Remember, we're all just trying to get home." But Frank's story didn't end there. Word of his grace and forgiveness spread beyond Cedar Valley. Veterans organizations across the country began sharing his story. He was invited to speak at military bases, community centers, and schools. At a VA hospital in Texas, he spoke to young soldiers returning from overseas. "Pain teaches us compassion," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "What doesn't break us, what doesn't make us bitter, makes us bridges for others." A wounded Marine, barely 25, raised his hand. "Sir, how do you forgive someone who treats you like you don't matter?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Son, forgiveness isn't about what they deserve. It's about what you need to carry forward. I carried anger for decades from the war. It ate at me from the inside. When I chose to let it go, I didn't just free the bus driver. I freed myself." The room fell silent. Outside, rain began to fall, the same kind of drizzle that had defined that morning on Route 47. Months later, Frank received a letter that would change the trajectory of his remaining years. It was from a teacher in Oregon who had used his story in her classroom to teach about empathy and civic responsibility. Dear Mr. Morrison, it read, my students want to know if you'd come speak to them. They're organizing a Frank Morrison Kindness Day at our school. They want to learn how to see people the way you do. What followed was a 2-year journey across America. Frank, despite his age and limited resources, began speaking at schools, churches, and community centers. Always the same message: see each other, help each other, choose kindness. In Detroit, he spoke to inner-city kids who'd never known a world without violence. In suburban Atlanta, he addressed wealthy teenagers who'd never known real struggle. In rural Montana, he shared his story with farming families facing foreclosure. The common thread was always the same: people hungry for connection, for meaning, for proof that humanity still mattered. Sarah Williams often traveled with him, having taken a leave of absence from her job to help coordinate his speaking tour. She'd become like a granddaughter to him, and he the grandfather she'd never had. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked him one evening as they sat in yet another hotel lobby, preparing for yet another speaking engagement. Frank looked out the window at the city lights, each one representing a life, a story, a person trying to make their way home. "Because Helen used to say that every act of kindness creates a ripple," he said softly. "I spent 40 years after the war trying to forget what I'd seen, trying to just survive. But that day on the bus, when people came looking for me, when they cared about a stranger, I realized Helen was right. Kindness multiplies." He turned to Sarah. "That young man, Robert, he sees people now, really sees them. Those passengers who shared my story, they're more likely to help the next person in need." It spreads, Sarah, like rings on a pond. 2 years into his speaking tour, Frank's health began to decline. The old war wounds, the constant travel, the emotional weight of sharing his story, it all took its toll. But he kept going, driven by letters from people whose lives had been touched by his message. A bus driver in Seattle wrote, "I keep a photo of you on my dashboard. When passengers test my patience, I ask myself, what would Frank do?" A teenager from Phoenix, "I was planning to hurt myself, but your story about choosing forgiveness over anger saved my life." A mother from Maine, "My son is autistic and was being bullied at school. I shared your story with his teacher, and now the whole class looks out for him." The ripples had become waves. 1 year later, Frank Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by Sarah and a handful of the many lives he'd touched. The funeral was standing room only. Veterans from 5 different wars attended. City officials, bus drivers, social workers, students, teachers, and hundreds of strangers whose lives he'd touched simply by choosing kindness over bitterness. Sarah Williams spoke at the service. "Frank taught us that dignity isn't something you earn or lose based on the money in your pocket. It's something you carry inside and something you recognize in others. He never asked for special treatment. He just asked to be seen." The city named the Morrison Street bus stop after him. A small plaque reads, "Frank Morrison Memorial Stop. See each other. Help each other." But his real memorial exists in the countless acts of kindness performed daily by people who remember his story. The bus drivers who show extra patience, the passengers who offer to help, the children who learned empathy in classrooms where his story was shared. Robert Chen still drives Route 47, but now he carries a small card in his pocket with Frank's words. "Rules exist to help us treat each other better, not to give us excuses to treat each other worse." And every morning, when he stops at the Morrison Street station, he remembers the old man with the grocery bags, the young woman with the phone, and the community that came together because someone chose to see beyond the rules to the human being who just needed to get home. The Frank Morrison Foundation, established by Sarah Williams, continues his work. They provide free bus passes for veterans and elderly passengers, fund kindness education programs in schools, and support community initiatives that bring people together. 3 years after Frank's death, the foundation sponsored a national See Each Other Day, where communities across America were encouraged to perform acts of kindness for strangers. Over 1 million people participated. In Cedar Valley, they unveiled a statue of Frank at the Central Bus Terminal. Not a grand monument, but a life-size bronze figure of an elderly man sitting on a bench, grocery bags at his feet, with an empty space beside him where visitors can sit. Children often climb up next to him. Teenagers pose for photos. Elderly passengers rest beside him while waiting for their buses. And sometimes, when the rain falls softly like it did that morning years ago, flowers appear in his bronze hands, placed there by people who understand that kindness, like memory, never really dies. It just waits for the next person willing to pick it up and carry it forward. Sometimes the smallest acts of cruelty create the biggest opportunities for kindness. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see injustice and say, "This is not okay." And sometimes from the most ordinary moments, a bus fare, exact change, a rainy morning, come the most extraordinary reminders of what it means to be human. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't walking alone in the rain, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to True Veteran Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.